What's up, guys? It's Rowan and Terry here from ArtofSmartTV, and we're bringing you the next episode of the HSC Economics Review. Now, you may have heard that the RBA recently cut the cash rate. They dropped it to a new historical low of 1.25%. Now, what we want to really consider in this episode is, well, what factors do the RBA consider when they make cash rate decisions? What are the things that they look at to determine what they believe the cash rate is going to be? And importantly, why did they cut it now? What were the broader macroeconomic conditions that informed their decision to cut? Now, why is this going to be really useful for you as a HSC Economics student? Well, number one, we're going to look at some of the theory behind why they cut the cash rate, and that's going to be useful for your essays. More importantly, though, we're going to be analysing the real-life reasons in the macroeconomic economy as to why they cut the rates, and that's going to be really useful for the analysis side of your essays, and even potentially a sneaky short answer depending on what your trials and HSC exam look like. So let's jump in, and the first thing that I really want to dive into is there's been a lot of media attention on this idea that we've now got a negative real interest rate. And now my brain goes a little bit like all over the place, right? Like brain explosion. How can you have a negative interest rate?
So according to what's called the Fisher equation, which measures the nominal interest rates with the real interest rates and inflation, you've actually got a relationship between the real interest rate, which is the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Now that's because when we talk about nominal interest rates, they have a real component to them, but they also have to factor in inflation. Now I want to throw this back to you, Rowan. So if we do have a negative real interest rate, can you just quickly do the math for us?
So, look, if we think about it, we've got a cash rate of 1.25, okay? We've got inflation of 1.3, okay? So, some basic maths here, we get minus 0.05. So, practically speaking, the reason this is important, the implication of this is, if you're putting money in the bank, right? And of course, you're going to be getting an interest rate that's different to the cash rate. This is why it's a simplification, but it's a useful way to understand it. If you're putting money in the bank, what it's saying now is that if the cash rate was the interest rate that you were receiving a return for on that money, you would be making a loss for having that money in the bank, right? Because it wouldn't be the interest rate repayments that you would be earning would not be covering the inflation. So it's an interesting situation that we find ourselves in right now. So I suppose, Terry, for the RBA to cut the rate, right, that's obviously a pretty momentous decision here to get to this point. For a moment, stepping back at a theoretical level, what are the factors that the RBA is going to consider when they make a rate decision?
Okay, so the first thing is that we have to remember the RBA has three key objectives. Right, the first objective is obviously price stability of the domestic economy. So that usually means that they have an inflation target of 2 to 3%. So the RBA believes that when inflation is 2 to 3%, that's when prices are typically stable and the economy is growing at a sustainable level. The next thing on their list is full employment, okay? And so you might have heard this referred to sometimes as the Nauru, okay? So historically, the RBA used to aim for about 5% as their full employment rate. This is now being revised to 4.5% to reflect the fact that our full employment rate is actually lower, which means that we've actually improved over time. And then lastly, it's just the economic welfare and prosperity of the Australian people, which is a really fancy way of saying, let's grow our economy so that we can get some economic development going on, and that usually occurs at 3 to 4%.
And so the important thing is that, yes, the RBA does inflation targeting, right? So their primary objective is inflation, 2 to 3%, but really they're all very interconnected. And so often in considering cash rate decisions, they're really needing to look at, as a result, a huge range of factors in the economy. And a simple way to break these down is some domestic and some global factors, right? So some things that are happening within the Australian economy, and then things that the Australian economy is interacting with, okay, with the global economy. So, at a basic level, of course, you've got the inflation rate is a factor, but also input costs are going to play a role. We've got inflationary expectations, so that it's the extent to which, we believe the inflation is going to occur or not is a huge issue. Economic growth and general sort of, consumption trends are going to be important. That's going to include wage growth and productivity. You want to check one of our other HSC Economic Review episodes that's going to dive into wage growth because it's a really important issue for the Australian economy. And we've of course got investment levels and confidence. Now, they're all the domestic factors that the RBA will typically consider. What are some of the global factors, Terry, that they'll look at?
Okay, yeah, so it's important to understand that the RBA does actually have a lot of interest in what's going on around the world. This is mainly stuff from your topic 2, so things we're talking about with Australia's relationship with the rest of the globe. So firstly, it's commodity prices, simply because this is such a large export for Australia. So obviously we need to be considering those prices, as they will directly influence the amount of revenue we get from exports. We've got our terms of trade, which is again linking into that export component. We've got global economic growth, so just to see how our neighbours are typically growing, because if they're growing well, typically we grow well as well. Okay, then we've also got, more explicitly, the economic growth of our trading partners. We've then got our exchange rate. Okay. Then we've got imported inflationary pressures, and finally global monetary policy stances, because at the end of the day we do also need to look at what's going on in the rest of the world, what the other central banks are doing. The RBA does actually factor this into their decisions as well.
Because there's been considerable coordination, really, particularly post GFC, of monetary policy decisions globally, particularly I guess over the G20. So now that we've looked at the theoretical, here's what they could consider, okay, when they're making a cash rate decision. They've dropped the cash rate. So let's consider what they did actually consider, and note every single month when the RBA makes a cash rate decision, and that could be a decision to keep it the same, it could be to change it. They publish a statement, which is a fairly short description, and they publish some minutes. Now the minutes are a little longer, and so these are publicly available, and honestly they're one of the best sources of information that you're going to get on current trends of the Australian economy during the HSC course. It's like they've summarised 20 different articles and plugged it into one awesome statement. So it's one of the simplest hacks that you can use as a HSC Economics student to really stay up to date and just show off in your essays. So let's jump in. Let's start with the global factors, I think, first here, because there's a lot of interesting things going on. What have been some of the global factors that the RBA looked at and really considered in dropping the cash rate?
So the first thing, just to start broad, right? So broadly speaking, the global economy hasn't been growing as predicted, right? So we've predicted, forecasted 3.9% in 2019. Probably won't hit that. They've had to cut those forecasts to 3.7%, then to 3.5% again, and then we're not sure if it's really even going to hit 3.5%. Okay, so there is definitely a global slowdown occurring, and so therefore the RBA has had to think about, well, how do we position the Australian economy best to deal with this?
And I think that's a huge issue, because so much of our economic growth, it's been said up to 60% of our economic conditions domestically are driven by global conditions. So it's why the RBA, if you look at the trends over the last 20 years, their minutes increasingly are focusing on international context because of its increasing importance. So I think the other big factor here is, and it's clearly a huge driver of the slowdown in global growth as well, is China's slowing economic growth. They're our major trading partner. They're at a 28-year almost low, right, in their economic growth. It's still good. It's still over 6%, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot lower than it has been, and there's real concern. It's 6.5% is the target, but there's real concern with the escalation of the US-China trade war that growth may get even worse, that it's not going to sort of sit there and mosey along, like it's going to accelerate. So China, that's a big issue, and the trade war. What else is going on that they're concerned about globally?
Well, I'd say actually globally, if we actually look at some of the global cash rates, there actually have been very, very expansionary. Some have cash rates that are even lower than us. Okay, and for them, they've actually, it's almost funny, like we can see ahead of time what's going to happen to us by just looking at other countries. So they've dropped their cash rates super low, and it really hasn't done an awful lot for their inflation. So inflation has been quite low in those other countries, and so that's also because of the labour markets over there not being particularly full, right? A lot of spare capacity going on there as well, and so I think inflation, that's been a big talking point as well as this growth component.
Definitely, and I think we can see that through really the major advanced economies. There's concerns of like core inflation being below target in the US. Japanese growth slowing after an initial pickup. So the euro, the whole euro region is certainly seeing very subdued inflation, and it's also off the back of a very complicated Brexit with the UK as well that's just been dragged out, and it's creating uncertainty. And typically, uncertainty creates high inflationary environments, but I think here, because inflationary expectations have been so low now for so long, that uncertainty is not producing the same degree of inflation in upwards pressure on inflation that you might typically see. I think the other big thing is that commodity prices have really been moving all over the place. Like often the RBA might look at these global conditions and then go, but we're okay. We got strong commodity prices, we're going to be okay, but there's concerns about the degree to those as well. They've been really mixed. Some are up, some are down. And so really the RBA is looking at all of this and they're getting a little nervous, I think, for the Australian economy. Now, what did they consider domestically? What were the sort of key issues that the RBA looked at domestically and said, bugger, we've got to do something?
Well, I think the first stat that most economists will typically look at is growth, right? And growth hasn't been great. It's been 1.8% year on year, and that's been due to a numerous range of things such as low wage growth, low inflation, low consumption, low confidence. So
just like all of them, right?
So you want to go into a little bit more depth on some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think definitely. I think the big thing is, we have had 1.8% economic growth. To highlight, it's actually a per capita recession, right? So what that means is that our population has been growing quicker than our growth, right? So that has ramifications for living standards, okay? If we're seeing a per capita recession, it means actually while our economy is growing, it's not growing fast enough based on population growth to maintain the same living standards. So, that's a concern. Household spending still sucks. There's no other way to describe it, right? It's, slowing. It was 1.8% and they're seeing it slow even further. Unemployment, 5.2%. We've talked about underutilization being at 13.7 and growing. So they're concerned about that. And that's the real big issue here, is that actually the driving factor for monetary policy hasn't so far been the inflation rate in terms of the narrow, sort of way we might think about inflation. Actually, this decision has been much more based on labour market outcomes, right? So what are we talking about here, Terry?
So a big buzzword, I guess, that's going around at the moment is the spare capacity of the labour market. And this comes recently because just this year, the RBA and a bunch of other economists, they basically had to remodel and re-understand basically what the NAIRU or the full employment rate is. So when we talk, so just to get back to it, so when we do talk about having spare capacity, we're basically saying we're at an unemployment rate that's higher than our full employment rate, so that we've got a little bit of room to work with here. We can actually reduce our unemployment rate by that little gap there and not really expect inflation to pick up too much. And so they've reviewed that NAIRU, which they historically used to think was around 5%. They've actually looked at it and said, actually, hang on, it's probably closer to 4.5%.
So, and I think that the really interesting thing there as well is that for Australia, the ramification of this for the RBA, the implication is that if we've got that capacity in the economy, there's lower wage growth, right? Because as a result, employers, have multiple people that they can choose from a hiring pool. So there's less negotiation and upward pressure on wages. Now, this is important. And again, Terry and I, in an entire HSC Economics review episode, are going to really dive into what is quite a complex issue of wage growth. But for this episode, simply put, wage growth is the biggest determinant of consumption, right? Or wages, I should say. Wages determine consumption. Therefore, wage growth has a huge impact on consumption, and consumption drives up to 60% of our aggregate demand. So the way the RBA is looking at this is they're saying, hey, if we step back, the biggest lever that we need to pull here to get economic growth and inflation kicking is actually wage growth. And so, that's why what they've identified here is that, and as I said, basically, they don't see wage growth improving and necessarily inflation and economic growth really kicking to where they need to go unless unemployment can get to 4.5%, which is the new NAIRU. And so that's why really this cash rate decision, despite all of the global context, despite the traditional inflation targeting idea, it's actually much more driven by labour market in Australia and some of the outcomes that they're currently seeing. So I suppose a bit of a question here, what is our wage growth at right now? Like, where is it trending?
Okay, so wage growth is at 2.3%, and it's actually been the best that it has been in a number of years, but it's still very much far below the trend, and as Rowan mentioned, we discuss this in much more detail in another video.
That's right. So you want to find out why it's under trend, the causes of our low wage growth. You've got to jump in and watch that video. That video is going to be super helpful from an analysis point of view in more effectively analysing macro, and here's the kicker, micro policy as well. So what I want to really highlight is that this cash rate decision has been really driven by some concerns about wage growth and the labour market. How is the RBA expecting this cash rate cut, though, to actually have an impact on the economy?
Okay, so when the RBA does cut the cash rate, it actually has to move through a couple of channels, which is altogether it's called the transmission mechanism. So you've got a couple of channels in which this cash rate has to move through in order for it to actually impact the overall macro economy. So one of the first ones is the exchange rate, because when the RBA reduces the cash rate, it reduces the overall level of interest rates in Australia, and the argument is that then that makes investment into Australia a little less attractive, which reduces demand for the Australian dollar and therefore decreases the value of the exchange rate, which could then be useful for improving the competitiveness of our exports. What other channels are we talking about here?
And I think just to add to that idea as well, right, I think when we're thinking about like this sort of exchange rate effect, right, as one of these channels, I think the key here is something called the interest rate differential, right? And that's just comparing Australia's interest rates with the globe. We could drop our cash rate, but it could still be higher than everywhere around the globe, and so it'll have a more limited or muted impact on the exchange rate. If, though, it ends up changing the relationship significantly, so all of a sudden our cash rate reduction takes us below the average in sort of, the G20, then it'll have a more significant impact on the exchange rate. So you can evaluate this to get a sense of the degree to which this channel will have a significant impact on the economy. Now, I think that the most basic one, the most typical channel, though, is that it's going to, impact the cost of borrowing, right? So be a consumer or a business, all of a sudden the cash rate falling, it's just made the cost of borrowing cheaper. And so, what's interesting is, there's a fancy name given for this, which is the intemporal substitution effect. I probably mispronounced that horribly, okay? But the basic premise is it's designed to get people to change the timing of their spending decisions. So maybe they were going to spend something in the future, but now that the cash rate's lower and borrowing's cheaper, they might take out a loan now to actually make that purchase today as opposed to in 12 months. So it's designed to either delay spending or to bring spending forward and therefore increase consumption. So that's a really common way that the RBA expects cash rate decisions to have a transmission effect. There is one other way that they're expecting this, another channel that they're expecting this cash rate will have an impact. What is that, Terry?
Wait, are you talking about assets?
No, just the cash flow.
Oh, right. I was talking about assets. I was like, wait.
Yeah. So there is another channel, though, that the RBA is also expecting that this cash rate decision will have an impact on the Australian economy. What is that channel, Terry?
Okay, so Rowan just talked about new borrowing, but we've also got to remember that at the end of the day, actually, there's a lot more existing borrowing, right? A lot of households are usually quite leveraged; they're quite indebted already, and so what this drop in the cash rate does is, if provided that the banks actually provide that drop in their interest rates, they will actually have to pay a little bit less on their repayments, and so that will actually help put a little bit more money into the pockets of households, and that will theoretically encourage them to spend more. But a lot of times there is a little bit of inelasticity with this, right? Because if people do get the opportunity to pay down some of their debts, they might actually just do that instead of actually taking.
And I think that's been probably the issue that we've been seeing in the Australian economy. I think there's a real concern that we're seeing really diminishing returns on these further cash rates in terms of the effect, right? Because when the cash rate's already so low, and as a result, for many people, mortgage rates are a lot lower. They are seeing a trend of people paying them down rather than getting out there. They're going, households are going great instead of just, spending extra. This is our opportunity to get ahead on the debt that we've got, because that mortgage in the first place was way too big because house prices were crazy, right? So it hasn't really eventuated that way. But I think in saying all of this, I think there is certainly, a hope that it will lead to a little bit more, disposable income, and that'll flow through. And remember that it doesn't need to have you don't need to see a big impact because of a multiplier effect in the economy as well. Okay, in the sense that, one person's consumption is another person's income, and so if we can see some small changes, the RBA is hoping that that may be enough to kick us in the right direction. So they're the sort of main ways that the RBA is expecting this transmission to occur. I think the really big factor here, though, is not all the banks pass the rate on. I mean, ANZ. I shouldn't slander AMP. ANZ didn't pass on the cash rate, change. So a lot of the major banks did, and this is one of the real limitations, isn't it? The RBA doesn't have direct control of the bank's interest rate decisions. Mm-hmm. So if they don't pass the cash rate decision on, the RBA is sort of screwed, basically, like their hands are tied. Now, what did they try to do, though, to ensure that the cash rate would be passed on?
I think that was just another example here of them going out into the press, making some pretty selective words with their announcements. Yeah. So I can't remember, what was the exact wording?
I think, not even, the RBA and the government, I think Joe Frydenberg, the treasurer, also came out, and they pretty much slammed any bank for not passing it on. Like, they did not mince words. So, their only tool really is public pressure. Now, the tool is that if enough of the banks pass the cash rate changes on, all of a sudden, if you as a bank, so let's say ANZ, don't pass it on, they risk losing market share because they risk, homeowners with mortgages making a decision to change lenders. In saying that, most banks, and ANZ clearly maybe, the example here, know that they've got a fair bit of lock-in, though, with a mortgage. And they know that there's a lazy tax. A lot of people are lazy. They're not going to go and change their mortgage just because there was a 25 base cut in the cash rate. So it's one of the limitations, but it's one of the limitations when you're analysing monetary policy, you need to include, because it has a really big impact on the effectiveness. So I think the final thing here to consider is what do we think the likely impact of this cash rate decision is going to be on the economy? Like, we've talked a little bit about how we think maybe not as much on disposable incomes as the RBA would like. Beyond that, what's the impact going to be?
Well, I think if their main motivation in this case was to actually inspire a little bit more of employment outcomes and to get closer to that Nauru unemployment rate, I think that's probably going to be the likely outcome that's hopefully going to occur, that the employment starts to pick up a little bit, wages start to pick up, and then that will then have a flow-on effect and actually have some positive growth in the economy.
And I think the good thing is they're not doing it on their own, right? They're not out there the solo soldier trying to save the day. They do have some other things, arguably tax cuts through the budget, although they're questionable. Watch our budget episode to see the breakdown on those. We've got an increase in the minimum wage by 3% with the Fair Work Commission as part of labour market reform. So maybe that'll help drive wage growth as well. So there are some of these other policies that are all getting in to support monetary as they try to improve the economy. I think it's worth noting, though, AMP, so not ANZ, AMP, let's get clear on that. AMP's chief economist does think that while the near-term outlook looks positive, there is a real concern in 2020 because government infrastructure spending starts slowing at that point. And so at the moment, most of the wage growth we've seen has been in the public sector, not in the private sector. Okay, most of the investment growth in the Australian economy has been in the public sector, not the private sector. And this is due to the budget. And so a lot of that spending is going to start slowing in 2020. And so, the AMP chief economist says, look, we could end up seeing further declines in economic growth in 2020 if fiscal policy doesn't make some changes. Okay, so clearly, it's going to be an interesting couple of years for both the RBA and the government as they navigate this. Now, one final comment here is that the RBA does factor in the impact on income distribution in their rate decisions. And it's interesting to note that as part of their minutes, they actually explicitly looked at, the impact that, with net savers and net borrowers, right, of the extent to which cash rates would benefit different groups of people within the economy. And so they highlighted that with, a lot of people right now being net savers, it would actually potentially hurt some people, right? But they felt that was worth it because they really feel they need to grow the economy. And so what we see here is just the inherent conflicts that exist in the RBA making monetary policy decisions. So, if you have any questions for Terry or I about, the cash rate decision, leave it in the comments below. And of course, what do you think the RBA is going to do in the coming months? Will we see further cash rate cuts? Will they keep it at 1.25? What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments if they're going to put it up or down by the end of 2019. And we will see you
next time.